Idaho has a long history of mountain men and eccentrics, and Caribou Jack, or Jesse Fairchild, is one of these people. And he came down from British Columbia, Canada, and he was a weaver of tall tales, and he would say these crazy things, and when people questioned him, he would say, "Oh, I can tell you haven't been to Caribou. I'm from Caribou." And Caribou, everybody knows that's true. And so they started calling him Caribou Jack, and everybody just kind of thought he was crazy because he was one of those old gold miners. You know, there's gold in them hills. And then, in 1870, he discovers gold on what is now called Caribou Mountain. And it sparks a 20-year-long gold rush. A lot of people, there's stories about Caribou Jack's hidden treasure. And nobody really knows how much gold was exported. They think it could have been anywhere between less than $1 million to, I've seen estimates of $20 million. And this was right along the old Oregon Trail. It passed right through here. You have victims of Indian massacres on the Oregon Trail buried in this cemetery. And the idea that they were all heading towards California and Oregon looking for gold, but nobody actually bothered looking in the mountains right around here, is kind of interesting. Caribou Jack made a name for himself as a mountain man and eccentric, and it worked for him. Like many cemeteries along the old Oregon Trail, the first grave here was that of an immigrant family who either died or was killed along the path to Oregon. And it's said that in 1861, a family, a mother, a father, and their 5 children, were killed by Indians along a creek about a half a mile away from here. And they were buried after an advance party was sent back to see why they hadn't caught up that following night. And this party was led by a man by the name of Goodhart. And nobody had any coffins inside of their wagons. It wasn't something they actively prepared for, so they nailed the lid of the coffin shut, and they buried them here between what is now 2 trees. It was said that they buried them under a large tree here so that people would remember them. And over time, people have come back and set up gravestones. But this is a very famous story along the old Oregon Trail, and it's commonly told, being buried in your wagon box. Buried here is another old pioneer, Richard Grant, son of another man by the name of Richard Grant, who was the chief trader at Fort Hall, Idaho. And back in the day, that would have been jointly occupied in a very kind of diplomatic, uneasy status by both British and American troops. And he was the chief trader for the Hudson's Bay Company. And you have some other people who came down from Canada as well buried in this cemetery. Caribou Jack, the most famous. Settlers on the old Oregon Trail who made it as far as Idaho would find themselves entering on the eastern part of the state. And if you want to explore the old Oregon Trail, you should start around Soda Springs, which is where the Wagon Box Cemetery is. You can find the old grave of a family who was massacred by the Native Americans here. Had they made it just a few more miles down the road, they would have come into the old Fort Hall. These forts were established along the trail to protect immigrants from the Native Americans. And it was here at Massacre Rocks State Park that a lot of these confrontations actually took place. The name, they believe, stems to an attack that happened a few miles to the east of here in 1862, August 9th and 10th. 5 wagons were attacked, and as many as 20 Shoshone people were killed, and at least 5 people, or 8 settlers, but we don't know which. And a number of attacks happened all throughout here. And it's not necessarily called Massacre Rocks for one specific incident. It's called Massacre Rocks because the path of the trail takes right along this river, the Snake River, and it provides perfect opportunities for Native Americans to attack settlers coming through. And along this river are dotted a few other massacre sites. Up the river about 15 miles you have the Clark Massacre of 1851, which I believe is fascinating because of the possibility of it being a Mormon attack, or at least kind of egged on by the Mormons, because some people within this attack on the offending side were said to have white beards or blonde beards, something that Native Americans don't normally have. But this is Massacre Rocks, and one of the most defining features of the Oregon Trail here in Idaho. and over there is the Snake River, and we're about 2 minutes away from Register Rock. Now, these immigrant trains would often camp along the river, and sometimes large rock outcroppings were used to kind of leave your mark and let future people know that you were there. And I've heard that there's some fascinating carvings still in this rock, and it's a historic site, so you don't got to pay for it in the same way that you would for the state park over at Massacre Rocks itself. There's actually some decently sized boulders all around here. The one under the pavilion has the most interesting markings from the pioneer days, but some of these rocks to my left are actually, I mean, they've got people marking them during the Great Depression and the 1920s. Still pretty interesting. And it's cool, I think, how the road follows the same path. Modern highways follow these same paths that were laid down in the 1850s and 1840s. And if you look through here underneath the bridge, you can see the river. And that is a small fork off of the main Snake River, and the pioneers would have camped right along the banks here. Shadow of the main Register Rock, you have the Indian head carving and also a preacher, and they were carved on this rock in 1866 and dated by a young boy aged 7 named J.J. Hansen. He went on to Portland, Oregon and became a pretty well-known sculptor, and he came back in 1907 and dated it a second time. And it's fascinating to think of a 7-year-old child on the Oregon Trail. Most of the carvings on the Register Rock now aren't that visible, but the story goes, and there's still some examples of this near Almo at the Rock City area, and this is a more recent one, of them taking the axle grease from their wagons and painting the rock. And the one in Almo, for some reason, is better preserved because of the weather out there. But if you take a look around here, you can still see some of the better ones, 1872, 1862, 78, 68, right after the Civil War. And it looks like that guy is saying that he was born in 1735. Imagine, he could have seen the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and then he could have come to see the Indian Wars, and it's fascinating to see all this history out here. Here along the Raft River area, a tributary of the Snake River, in 1851, a brutal massacre took place, and I think that the more fine details of this massacre are truly fascinating because of implications they have for later Mormon history or just for outlaw history. The story goes that at the time, a chief of the most powerful War Shoshone clan that stretched from eastern Oregon all the way over to western Montana and all throughout southern Idaho, a man by the name of Cho was running low on supplies, and he and his band would often prey on immigrants along the Snake River of the Oregon Trail. At the time, they actually called these Shoshone people the Snake Indians. And so he went to his uncle up in Oregon, or along the Oregon Trail somewhere, to retrieve arrows, but he knew that he needed to rekindle his supplies. He needed to get more ammunition, more horses, and more things for raiding immigrant parties. So he set his eyes on the Clark wagon train, and he followed them for a while, scouting out in the hills, and he sees them come through, and as they do every day, Mrs. Clark, Hodgson, and Grace Clark all go a few miles up ahead to this spot right behind me along the Raft River, and looking right ahead I can see the Snake River running right past. And so the main party of the Clark wagon train would have seen them just a couple miles down that way, or at least heard the gunshots. And eventually these gunshots did ring out. Cho and his band kind of rode off of the hills, and I'll put in a video of these hills, but they rode down into the valley of the river, and they started massacring them. Immediately, Hodgson tries to hop on the wagon because he tips his wagon over to provide a defensive structure, and he is shot through the chest and dies immediately. Mrs. Clark dies because Grace tries to jump on top of her to shield her from a bullet, but the bullet goes through Grace's wrist and hits her mother in the heart, and she dies the next day. And then the Indians come up and shoot her And Grace is shot from the armpit all the way through her body, and she's totally stunned. So the Shoshone people begin tearing her clothing off, and she later remarks that they thought that she was dying, or at least dead. And so she said that they spoke American. Those were her words. They spoke in an American accent, but she, I believe, died shortly thereafter. No, actually, she did survive, because when the gunshots were heard in the camp initially, the rest of the party was too afraid to go and launch a counterattack until it had gone on long enough, and eventually they came riding forward, but it was only one man with his pack dogs behind him. And Chochoko sees a rising cloud of dust and thinks that it's a large party, and he runs off. And this was after they had started scalping Gracie Clark, so they roll her into the ditch and start piling rocks on top of her, throwing them down into the ditch, and it leaves a scar on her forehead that lasts for the rest of her life. And it's her testimony that says they spoke in an American accent. And then the brother of the family launches a raid on their fortified position along the Snake River, unable to dislodge them, but he testified and said a lot of them had sandy blonde beards and blue eyes. Now, at the time, the Mormons down in Utah Territory were trying to convert the Shoshone people, and it was an easy process because they were opposed to the U.S. Army, and the Mormons at the time were as well. Not totally, it wasn't the Utah War yet, but they were saying, hey, maybe we could provide some protection. Or this could have maybe not been the Mormons, it could have just been regular white raiders or white outlaws. And it was later said that they believed this because a while back they had been offered money to buy their horses by some people on the Mormon Trail, and when they said no, this massacre happens. An older Shoshone man makes off with most of their horses, and they see them later for sale in Salt Lake City. Now that must have been a very awkward encounter. But who these white bearded men were at the Clark Massacre of 1851, nobody really knows. And it's said that Clark himself continued along a non-traditional route on the Oregon Trail, totally distraught from this massacre, and that he was the one who named Pilot Butte in eastern Oregon. Some of the most beautiful scenery on the Oregon Trail, a lot of people look to Wyoming, but I think one of the prettiest routes to follow is along the Snake River in the state of Idaho. And here at Canyon Creek, we have an area that was used by pioneers after crossing a dozen miles of rocky desert. You would come here. This was shortly after you left the Snake River route. And it's just north of Mountain Home in the Bruneau Sand Dunes, which a lot of people also camped at. And starting in the 1870s, people began to homestead here. And this was when Oregon was kind of vouched for, and people started stretching back along the trail, and Idaho became a very popular place for people to settle down. And this building here, the Canyon Creek Station, this is some of the original structure. The original I'm looking at right now, but they rebuilt it. It was used all the way up until 1921, burned down in the 1970s, and only a few years ago they put the roof on it. And you can tell this is all new, but this is one of the most surprisingly intact structures in the Idaho stretch of the Oregon Trail. From the Canyon Creek Station, it looks like that is probably one of the homesteaders, or a death along the old Oregon Trail, but it's kind of on private property now. It continued in use up until the death of the homesteaders in 1921. Old copper pipe, melted glass, loads of porcelain, and then out here, the original site and the original fireplace. This whole canyon would be overcrowded with wagons sometimes.